remarkable. Our next speaker, Daniel Rogers, well, is a partner with King and Spalding, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about that. He's going to talk to us about potential contracts and legal structures.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. And first of all, I'd like to thank Ken and Simon for inviting me out to speak. It's very nice to be here. And back when I started doing LNG projects, I had a full head of hair and it was brown. So I've been in the game for quite a while. I think we can go to the next slide. I'll take one slide to, as I say, pimp my firm. I'll tell you who we are and what we do. We're off island for Guam, but I am on the island of Singapore right now. If we can back up one, actually. But our firm's about 850 lawyers in 17 offices around the world, and of those, I co-head the firm's LNG practice. Of those 850 lawyers, on any given day, about 40 of our lawyers are working on LNG projects all around the world. And I think in the last 15 years, I've personally worked on about 27 import terminal projects, several of which on islands similar to this one. I think it was Simon who said earlier that you want to be the second mouse because you want to get the cheese, not the trap. Actually, you guys will be somewhere between the fourth and the eighth mouse. There are several mice. There's three that have already gotten across the finish line. Puerto Rico, the Ecoelectrica project in '98. AES Andres in the Dominican Republic. There's now another project in the Dominican Republic that we're advising on that's an FSRU that may be in line ahead of you. There's the Singapore LNG project that I spent, and the reason I live in Singapore now, I spent a lot of my time putting that together. But Jamaica's just awarded, after about 9 different RFPs. I mean, if you want to learn how not to do it, take a long, hard look at how Jamaica has floundered. I think they finally sorted out their problems and awarded an FSRU contract, and we're told that there's a company from the region out here that's providing power under a PPA, so it looks like that project may actually finally be coming together. I've been watching that project for quite a long time. Indonesia is now looking at LNG imports. We're working on one of the several projects there. Hawaii, interestingly enough, you heard earlier about HECO going out for an RFP for LNG supply, but what hasn't really made the news is that Hawaii Gas took delivery of its first LNG ISO tank tanker last week. So Hawaii Gas is already in the LNG import game in Hawaii, not in a big way, but they're getting started. And we'll talk a little bit about ISO tank tankers in a bit as well, because I've got a newfound interest in that. I'm working with one of the projects in Canada that wants to provide LNG through ISO tank tankers. So anyway, there's a lot of company. There's on island-based power, LNG fuel for power, constrained market. There's people that have been there, they've done that. There's some lessons to be learned. I'll try to walk through a few of those as we go through the presentation. If we can go to the next slide, please. I think we probably can skip this. Some of this, what I did to prepare was I looked at the IRP for last year just to get some background. And so that's sort of the framework behind the presentation, but if we can skip the slide to the next one. I think some of these statistics are also very familiar to you. The interesting thing, actually, if we skip to the next slide, the LNG supply needs. Based on my back of the envelope math, and don't ever trust my math, I went to law school for a reason. I started out life as an engineer, and I decided that I just didn't like the math. So, but here, I think R.W. Beck has done the math as well. 0.25 MTPA, sort of on a today basis, with growth and some new generation and things, could be 0.35 to 0.5 MTPA. Now, where that puts Guam, I mean, that's a relatively small customer in the global LNG world. I mean, Biljana did a great job of illustrating all these projects out here. They're mega projects. We're advising on a couple of them, including a $40 billion project in Mozambique now. Most of those suppliers aren't terribly interested in talking to buyers in this size range. That's not to say that all of them aren't. In fact, Mozambique is talking to a 0.35 million ton per year buyer in Japan right now in the process of negotiating that supply contract for them. So there are big projects that will take notice and they'll be interested in you. But you're on the smaller side, you're on the smaller end. You may not be the priority customer that gets all the bells and whistles in your contract because you just don't quite have the volume. You may not get the flexibility that you want because you're a smaller off-taker in a much bigger project and they need to focus their flexibility and things on the bigger buyers. So, but that's not to say that there aren't opportunities out there with some of the big guys as well. If we can skip to the next slide. So anyway, yeah, I think you're slightly below the sweet spot for most conventional LNG producers, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to get their attention anyway. Arguably too large for containerized LNG supply. Now, I use the word arguably because we've actually had arguments within my firm. Some of my partners who, when I rolled this out to them, they said, no way, this is too much demand. There's too much logistics to do this in ISO containers. I'm not sold. I actually think that ISO containers are probably a very realistic option for Guam and something that you should spend some time looking at a little bit more carefully. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I may have a little bit of an angle there because we're getting involved in one of those projects. But I'll go through some of the ins and outs of the ISO containers. I mean, the advantage is that if you can do it, I'm sorry, if you back up one, the advantages for ISO containers is that, substantially lower capital costs. You don't have to build all of this storage. I mean, the storage is in the tanks themselves. So upfront capital costs, much, much lower. Higher transportation and logistics costs, though, definitely. And it's something to look at. And there have been some studies out there about what it costs on a per unit basis to move stuff in an ISO container. And it's not cheap, but you need to compare that with what you're thinking about spending for your on-site storage and everything else and see whether it works for you. You don't need the deep water access that you need for a lot of LNG facilities. If you've got an existing container terminal facility, you don't need to do any more dredging. You don't need to build breakwaters and jetties and things. You've got the infrastructure that you need, or most of it. You get out of the Jones Act issue, which I think is a large part of what's driving Hawaii's interest in ISO containers. Hawaii's got the same problem. Puerto Rico, Eco Electrica has a Jones Act issue too, but they've managed through some very, very careful and very clever lobbying and other finagling to get some waivers that I'm not sure can be replicated again. If you want to buy LNG from the U.S. and that's important to you, the Jones Act is a major, major issue for you to get your arms around, and it could be a deal killer issue for you, and it's something that you certainly should try to get your arms around before you make any commitments. But ISO containers get you around that because you're just putting a container on a U.S. flag, U.S. crude, U.S. built ship that was already coming to Guam. It's not as disruptive to the port. We saw earlier with some of the presentations, I think including Doug's, with the safety zones and things, and the fact that you've got to close down the port for an hour when the LNG tanker comes in, and you've got security issues. In an ISO container, I'm not aware of anything yet where they put security zones around container ships coming in with ISO containers. Maybe they will someday, but we don't have that problem today. And probably most importantly, I think you can probably buy LNG out of an ISO container on much less onerous contract terms than you can under conventional LNG SPA. And again, I grew up doing conventional SPAs, and that's pretty much all I do. So I know the ins and outs of those contracts quite well. I've been talking with people about LNG out of ISO containers, and they're saying they don't think they really need take or pay. You may have a very, very generous cancellation rights under those contracts. Just tell them, I'd only need 20 containers next month instead of 30. Pay a cancellation fee, which is going to cover some of the non-utilized, the dead freight, transportation costs that they absorb, maybe some of the tank rental, for instance. They'll take those containers and they'll flick them off to somebody else. So you may be able to sign shorter-term contracts with much less financial exposure. If you need to look at the whole picture, but I think there's an opportunity there where if you're really worried about that type of an exposure, that may be helpful to you. Disadvantages, not a lot of current suppliers out there are supplying in this form. Again, one of the things in the very first slide after the King and Spalding slide was, diversity of supply. That was what in your IRP last year was one of the highlights. You wouldn't be as diverse starting out. That's not to say that the world isn't going to evolve and that there aren't going to be a lot more suppliers that provide LNG in this format. But starting out, there's very few to choose from. As I mentioned earlier too, logistics and handling costs. You're probably going to have more emissions just because you're going to have a lot of equipment offloading these containers, moving them around. You're going to have trucks shuttling them around the island, picking them up when they're empty and bringing them back, reloading them, and things like that. So you need to spend some time looking at that aspect of things too. And then the cyclone issues. What are you going to do? You've got 250 tank containers stacked up somewhere, near the coast, and you've got a cyclone coming. So you've got, again, there's pluses and minuses to all of this. But anyway, I just thought I would throw that out before I get too far into my materials. Okay, but I think where I came out, assuming that isotainers isn't the answer, small scale LNG does seem to be the answer. And small scale, the way I've defined it, is sort of between 30,000 and 90,000 cubic meter tank storage, which is relatively small in the world of LNG. I think 90,000 was about where R.W. Beck, who did a study for you guys a few years ago, came out that was the right size. The concern, though, when you get to that size of a facility, you do dramatically reduce your capital costs, but you also reduce the available LNG shipping fleet that you have to choose from if you want to go with existing ships that are in service today. There's only about, in the R.W. Beck study, they were recommending the 75,000 cubic meter class ship. There's only 3 of those in existence in the world, and they're about 40 years old. So you're probably looking at new build LNG shipping capacity, which again, you need to look at what does that do to your capital cost, and given how much LNG you need annually and how much those ships would go unutilized, is that really a wise use of your money as well? Next slide, please. But the small-scale LNG, does come with great advantages. Significant upfront capital cost reductions. We've seen some small-scale LNG projects that are kind of in the ballpark, I think, of the numbers that you guys have put up in terms of what you think the capital cost will be. There are some existing small-scale projects in operation today in Sweden and places like that. The one in Sweden, I believe, was built in 25 months from LOI to mechanical completion. Very, very fast construction timeline. Lower overall operating and maintenance costs. Better potential for what I call one-stop shopping. There are some players like Lind, Energy World, a couple of others out there that are in the market. They're guys who can provide your power plant conversion capabilities, LNG supply, and small-scale LNG. They're sort of targeting that as their target market. There's not a lot of them, and there's not a long track record, but there are people out there, and if you want to go to one contractor and not part this project out to a bunch of different contractors, small scale is probably the way to achieve that. Disadvantage is, again, very few suppliers at small scale. Again, most LNG projects in the world are these giant, 7 million ton per year, per train, with a series of trains, production facilities. Not a lot of people sort of producing and selling at small scale, or selling in quantities that are targeted to small scale buyers. Like I said, you'll probably need new LNG vessels. And not as much flexibility to swap cargoes or divert cargoes. Once you sort of get down outside of the standard, today's standard is really probably more 135 to 170,000 cubic meter ships. There are some 125 still in service, but once you get sort of outside of that sweet spot, there's not a lot of available LNG shipping capacity. It's sort of the industry is sort of operating within that size range. So swapping cargoes and sending things off when the rest of the world is operating at that scale becomes a little bit more challenging for you if you've gone small scale. So again, there's no magic silver bullet here. There's pluses and minuses to all of this, but it's good to see that you guys are getting good advice and that you're looking at all of this. Next slide, please. And one of the things I'm going to walk you through is just basically how do you go about on the procurement side. You need some power plant conversions. You're going to need some new power plants. You're going to need some LNG supply and LNG transportation. How do you go about contracting for that? What's your RFP strategy? So I've sort of tried to simplify the world and boil it down to 3, what I call the bundled supply package, partially unbundled, and then the completely unbundled. Next slide, please. The bundled supply package is you're going to go out to one contractor, and your primary contract is probably going to be a power purchase agreement, because he's going to go outsource the LNG. He's going to build whatever needs to be built, convert whatever needs to be built, and then he'll provide you with power under a PPA. That's probably the easiest in terms of just getting your arms around it, negotiating it. It's one, maybe a gas supply agreement, depending on how you structure things. You managing it and having your arms around it. It's probably the hardest one to pull off, though, because next slide, please. Okay, thanks. Yeah, you're probably going to need a contractor consortium, because there's not a lot of people out here who do this sort of on a turnkey basis. There's a few. I've named a few. Energy World is one of those. I don't represent them, and I'm not recommending them, but they are out there, and we have seen them do this. You're probably going to need a consortium that's strong in infrastructure development, and then it will probably go out and run its own LNG procurement process, because most of these consortia are not also in the LNG production business. They will go out and they'll source the LNG under their own LNG RFP procurement and pass it on to you. Critical part of all of this is that the financial strength of this consortium needs to be looked at very, very closely, and ensuring that there's someone or some ones that are financially standing behind this consortium in the event that there's a performance failure will be absolutely critical to you. Next slide, please. Okay. To the conventional LNG producer market, this is probably not what they want to see, and you probably won't get a lot of traction. And just as an aside, I'm going to talk about the producer supplier market in just a minute, and I'll talk you through the different types of suppliers and the ins and outs of how they might view your project as well. But as I said, there are some on a small scale basis. There are some firms. You see the names there in the second bullet point that are active in this market. They're sort of still in startup phase. There's not a long track record with any of them in this business, but they're out there and they are doing things. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is just a diagram just to show how simple the bundled supply package is. GPA, of course, just one contract, and everything else goes on behind the curtain. Next slide, please. And shifting gears, the second one, the partially unbundled supply package, involves breaking out sort of the power infrastructure and the LNG stuff, as I call it, the LNG import facilities, storage facilities, and the LNG fuel supply. The LNG import facilities, again, the guys who are going to build it are primarily in the construction and operation and maintenance game and not LNG supply game, so they're probably going to have to go out, and just as in the bundled arrangement, they're going to have to go out behind the scenes and run their own LNG procurement in order to have the LNG to provide to you. And again, all of these are going to involve people who are going to want markups and things. Next slide, please. Problem once you start dividing it up is you get some potential misalignment. You may have construction delays. You may have any number of other things, performance issues, where at the end of the day, when you've got more than one contractor, they're all pointing at the other guy saying it was his fault. And once you part it out like this, you're not going to get an overall project wrap, so you're not going to have one single party that you can go to make sure that everything works well, or you can hit them with liquidated damages. So it's going to require quite a lot of supervision from Guam Power Authority. Okay, we can go. Yeah, and the next one. This is just a diagram. You're going to get the materials, so I'll skip through that. I recognize I'm what stands between you and happy hour right now, and we're a little behind schedule, so I'm trying to keep it moving. The third one, the fully unbundled supply package, means break out the power infrastructure, the LNG infrastructure, and the LNG fuel supply, and run separate tenders for each of those pieces. That's probably the most, I don't know, probably sane, rational, logical way to go about doing it, because it breaks things out. You're looking at people who are specialists at what they do and only what they do. But it does put a lot of pressure on Guam Power Authority to have a good construction management team, stay on top of things, because again, you're not going to have a single contractor providing a wrap. You're going to effectively be the guy who makes sure that everyone performs according to their contract requirements, and you get this thing delivered on time and on budget. So a little bit more pressure on GPA, but probably, at the end of the day, it's a little more targeted. It'll allow you to get the exact, the very best players and the very best, for the very best spaces. Next slide. Okay, yeah, I think that's just more detail on the above. And another wiring diagram. You can see how they get progressively more complicated. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to get into who's going to supply you LNG. I sort of grouped the world, and this is just my grouping. This isn't necessarily the rule. But there's the LNG producers, and those are the true, and those are the people that Biljana showed you the list. And there's a lot of them out there. The good news is I agree absolutely with Biljana. I think we are in a serious buyer's market right now. And I'm representing a lot of the suppliers, so it's not a fun place to be, but the buyers really, they do recognize there's a lot of LNG supply opportunities available today. Then you've got your LNG portfolio traders, and they're folks who are typically, they're the BGs, the BPs, we'll go through a few of them. They're involved in projects as well, but they take some of the offtake from projects where they have equity gas, they dump it in a portfolio, and then they shop that portfolio around. And then there are what we call pure or merchant traders, and these are some of the pure trading houses that don't have any investment or infrastructure in LNG production. And I'll walk you through some of the ins and outs of those. We can switch slides. Okay, yeah, LNG producers, and you can see the examples down there at the bottom. Apologies if that font is too small. I don't know why it got little. But these are the kind of the big headline LNG producers around the world. Many of whom are out in the market, still looking to sell quantities of LNG today. And their primary activity is they just produce and sell LNG. Their spot trading activities really aren't a material part of their business, although spot, as a percentage of the total gas demand, total gas that's been traded, as in the form of LNG, I think spot is somewhere in the 25, maybe closing in on 30% range. I doubt that it's going to get meaningfully larger than that because nobody is in the business of just producing LNG on a merchant basis and hoping that there's a buyer. Usually spot LNG comes about because contracts provide flexibility rights to buyers, and when buyers project that they're going to have an unseasonably warm winter or something, and so they scale back during the annual programming, they exercise their flexibility, they drop cargoes from the program. Suddenly the LNG producer now he had the ability to produce it, so he suddenly now has that LNG available for spot trading. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing some plants that after they debottleneck the LNG production facilities, they're able to produce anywhere up to 13% over nameplate capacity. And so that excess production capacity is something that's available. The lenders didn't need it for the financing, and so they're generating that for spot. Some of the projects, like the one I'm working on in Mozambique, they're probably going to sell 80% of their production on a base load long-term basis, and the other 20% they're going to hold back and sell either on spot or midterm. So there is that market out there, but it's not huge. And my personal view is I don't think it's going to get much bigger than it already is as a percentage. Next slide, please. Conventional producers, I think they are likely to be the lowest priced opportunity, just as to the fuel price itself. But they're going to be the least flexible in terms of quantity adjustments, particularly at the size that we're looking at for Guam. They're probably going to be very rigid about ship sizes because they're all building fleets to that's part of their liquefaction project is they have to build a fleet of ships in order to deliver product. They're building that fleet for their baseload customers who are 1.5, 2, in some cases 3 million tons a year. So they're building big ships for long haul capacity. So the LNG producers aren't going to be as flexible with you in terms of the ship sizes, delivery date changes, things like that, because again, you would be a small customer in their world and your quantities would be, per cargo are probably going to be on the lower end of the range. There's some exceptions there, including in Indonesia where there's some contracts rolling off and there's producers nearby that may be in a position to be a little bit more flexible with you. That facility's, the financing's all paid for, so they've got a lot less financial pressure, let's put it that way. You've got good proximity to places like Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, Canada, and the U.S. So I think you do have a lot of potential supply options in the Pacific Rim neighborhood, and that's out of the LNG producers. LNG portfolio traders, these are guys, again, there's an example in the second bullet point there. These are affiliates of some of the oil majors. That's just their trading arm, and they'll take a certain percentage, in some cases a very large percentage of the LNG production out of the facilities that they do, and they'll buy it themselves, and they dump it in their portfolio, and then they'll go out on the market and they'll sell it. My guess is you're probably going to find yourself when you get to the end, this is the universe of sellers that you're going to be talking to. They can offer more flexibility. They're the guys who are talking about 5-year term contracts, 10-year term contracts, whereas in a normal setting with a producer, you're usually talking about 20-year term contracts. These guys are able to be a little bit more flexible in terms of your downward flexibility rights under your contracts. They may be much more flexible in terms of your diversions. Some of them are even offering cancellation options that if you're oversupplied, and you need to reduce your quantity, and you discover it too late, you pay a fee, and you can drop cargoes. It's not cheap, but it's better than taking LNG that you don't need. And particularly if your other option is trying to divert that LNG and you're using small scale and nobody really wants it because it's too small, or you can't get the right price because it's not sort of the market's size. I think portfolio traders are a little bit better equipped to deal with those issues. Next slide, please. And then we have what we call the pure or merchant LNG traders. And these people, and there's examples in the second bullet point, there's people in there that are for real. They are in the market. They do have a track record of buying and selling LNG, but they don't have any investment. They don't have any equity gas rights in any LNG production project. So they're out there. They're bidding on every RFP for LNG supply that's out there. They're bidding. They're trying to get it, and if they can get it, then they have LNG in their portfolio to retrade. But they don't have a steady, regular source of LNG supply the way that a portfolio trader or an LNG producer does. And this isn't an exclusive list. These are just some of the ones that we've dealt with, some of which are clients of ours, and some of which we've dealt with from the other side. But these guys they'll come at a higher margin because, again, they're out in the market on a fairly real-time basis, bidding. A lot of times, even though they're sort of billed as merchant traders, they try to line things up as back-to-back as they can. So if they know you need 3 years of supply, they'll go out and tender for 3 years and then try to match things up so that they're not too long on LNG supply, because they've even got limits as to how much risk they can take on. So I think it's definitely a universe of suppliers that you should be looking at, but you need to look very carefully. You need to look very carefully at their balance sheet and make sure that you're comfortable that if they don't perform, you have adequate recourse against them. That's not to say that they're not performing; they are, but it's riskier. They don't have an investment in LNG. They don't have LNG already in the portfolio, so it's just a little bit higher risk supply source. Next slide, please. Okay, and then I'll close out with just some other issues to consider. I know that you guys, and there's been quite a bit of talk already about the onshore versus offshore. Nailing down location is probably one of the critical things that you're going to need to do earlier. The difference between onshore and offshore is going to have a very large effect on your capital cost as well. Expandability or interconnectivity of facilities with other potential users. We're moving, in the shipping world, we're moving to LNG-fueled ships. The Navy is going to be moving to LNG-fueled ships. I'm pretty certain of that. There's a big naval presence here in Guam. It makes a lot of sense to me that maybe one day Guam will become an LNG bunkering facility. And maybe to the extent you've got to invest in LNG berth, cargo transfer systems, cryogenic pipe, storage tanks, things like that you may not need to use on a day-to-day basis to the extent that you may wind up having to overbuild your facilities. Think about possibly entering into an agreement, either now or in the future, that allows someone else to have partial use of those facilities in order to try to reduce some of your carrying costs. I wouldn't base your project on that, and I wouldn't slow things down in order to do that, but I definitely think about, as you're framing this up, how do you do it in a way where it will actually facilitate your ability to do that if you decided later that you thought that was attractive to you. Jones Act shipping issues. It sounds like I heard earlier, it sounds like there's some expertise already. Yes, it's a huge problem moving LNG from the U.S. to Guam. There were a number of LNG ships back in the day that were U.S. built, U.S. flagged, and U.S. crewed, and they were all out flagged. I was involved in the chartering of them as soon as they were out flagged. But today there are no Jones Act qualified U.S. tankers. I do know of some shipping companies that want to get into that business, so if that's something that's of interest, I'd be happy to make some introductions. And then the ideal LNG supply contract term. Again, you guys, sounds like you're used to buying your liquid fuel on a 3 to 5 year ahead basis, not going 20 years. There are suppliers in the LNG world that can provide you that kind of shorter term LNG product, but they're not as many of the LNG producers, more the portfolio traders or the pure merchant traders. So sort of sorting out what your risk level, your risk tolerance is for the fuel price exposure on a going forward basis and things is going to be critical as well to making this initial decision on which direction you go for your LNG project. So with that, I think I'll leave it to questions. I think we can go next slide.
Okay. Ken?
I have a question, Dan. Sorry,
That's right. I came in under schedule.
We'll make a happy hour. You know, you talked about the endpoints, the upstream, the downstream, the end. Japan, Korea has a very large consumption of gas on an annual basis. I think it's 8 million, 6 million metric tons per year.
Yes, huge.
It's huge. Have you seen, or do you think it's possible to piggyback on somebody who's already negotiated long-term charters and long-term contracts, and let's say Guam would then negotiate with, I don't know if the U.S. allows some of these types of treaty agreements, but negotiate with Japan or Korea to get a slice of that for Guam. I think you kind of noted that on off-peak and seasonal effects where they want to unload some of that gas. Can you speak to that, if that's even a possibility where...
It may be a possibility. I think the way it normally works, that's a great question, by the way. The way it normally works, I think in Japan at least, is that a lot of the trading houses have LNG trading units. And so when the utilities are oversupplied and they can't exercise any more downward quantity tolerance under their contracts, they'll flick those cargoes, they'll assign those contracts over to the trading house. And the Japanese trading houses will then find a home for that LNG. So it may be having some discussions with those trading houses about having some type of a strategic relationship with them to get access to LNG. It may not be a long-term thing for you, and they may not be able to guarantee it on a regular basis, but sort of as a backup supply, that's probably not a bad idea.
Yes, John?
Yes.
You spoke of suppliers. Do they arrange the shipping, or do you have to arrange the shipping separate? That's one question. Next question is there a way that with our neighbor to the north, Saipan, they could use some natural gas, liquid natural gas as well? Is there a way of putting that together to make a better deal for the supplier?
Great questions. Yeah, I think on the first, who arranges the shipping, it's done two ways in LNG. It's done in what's called FOB, or free on board, where you, the buyer, will arrange your own shipping, and you'll go load at the producer's plant. You take title to the LNG at the producer's plant, and it's yours. You control the shipping. In my presentation, I'm sort of assuming that you may not want to be in that business because that gets you into the shipping business, and anybody who's been in the shipping, and it's a very complicated business when it gets to LNG. The LNG shipping business is very complex. You're going to have a room about, with this many people just running your shipping program for you. As a power utility, my thought was probably not the right answer for Guam. You probably want to get your LNG on what's called a delivered basis, where the supplier arranges the shipping. Normally the suppliers that arrange the they're optimizing anyway. They've got a number of ships. It's just easier for them to do. They prefer to sell that way, quite frankly. Most of the clients that I work with want to sell on a delivered basis because it gives them some control over their destiny. And if they've got extra cargoes and they've got their own shipping fleet, they can move things around and make money. Whereas if they've committed to sell everything FOB, they just, they don't have any control over that. They have to find a buyer that has a ship, which makes it more difficult. The second question had to do with sort of, I think, a buyer consortium was sort of, to me, is what it sounded like you were suggesting. I think that is possible. It's done within single country already. Japan has been doing it. There are several groups where a couple of the smaller utilities will get together and they will collectively sign a single LNG supply contract, and then they will work within the consortium over who gets what when. But as a buyer, they present one face to the seller, and it's a single contract. I haven't seen it done across borders yet, but there's no reason why it can't work. I mean, there may be some competition law issues that we need to look at and navigate in order to try to get people in different jurisdictions that are working together. But I don't see any threshold issue or reason why you couldn't do a buyer consortium.
Ileana, did you have a question?
It just occurred to me as I heard the question about Japan and cooperating with them. There's actually something I meant to highlight. We tend to use different BTU content of the gas.
Mm-hmm.
So LNG from the US, for example, if you think about it, it's going to be very dry. If
gonna
it's
be
from
low,
Japan, it's going to be very hot. And that depends on where you're sourcing it from. It's just something to consider when you're thinking about your facilities here versus where you're sourcing LNG.
That's correct. Yeah, that's a challenge for the Japanese. Some of the Japanese actually have to spike the LNG because they've been buying LNG out of Alaska since 1969, and it's very dry, like 950 BTU per standard cubic foot. And they actually spike propane into the LNG when they receive it in Japan before they put it in their power generating facilities, because the turbine manufacturers will only warrant the performance at a certain BTU spec, and U.S. source gas and Trinidadian gas as well is too dry. So they have facilities there to spike the gas to get the BTU content up. Not all buyers have it. It is an issue. I've represented some of the LNG, the Australian LNG coal seam gas to LNG projects. That's very dry gas too. And one of the things that we ran into in selling to the Japanese was they wanted what they called it. They used some buzzword. It was basically they wanted a discount because the heating value was too low, and they felt like they were going to have to make additional investment shoreside in order to bring the content up when it was landed. And we came back and said, well, we're selling on $1 per MMBTU, so if it's less MMBTUs, it's less dollars. It's, you're not getting a discount. But there's, it's arguable whether there still was a discount in that deal or not. But it's a good point that not all LNG is the same. There's LNG from places like Oman. Some of the Qatari volumes are very, very high in BTU content. The stuff out of the U.S. is going to be very low, and it's not completely interchangeable, and there are issues, particularly when you get to industrial uses. If you're running a glass factory and you're used to burning 1,000 BTU per SCF gas and somebody suddenly dumps 1,200 in, that may be within the pipeline spec and everybody's happy, but when you put that into your glass plant, it's going to cause all kinds of problems and you may have to shut down for a while. So there are some users that even, variability, even kind of within the expected energy content range in LNG still have problems if it fluctuates. So very good point.
Is the market purchasing on volume or purchasing on density?
It's purchasing on quantity. They're purchasing MMBTU, at least most of the market. So your contracts will be denominated in so many MMBTU per year. We're moving away from that a little bit. Portfolio sellers are now selling on a per cargo basis, which is a volume, which is you'll get 8 132,000 cubic meter ships plus or minus 2% or whatever, and that's what they're selling. But the traditional producers are still selling, we'll give you so many trillion BTU per year on a take or pay basis, and then you've got to sort out with the shipping and everything else how to make it all work and make it fit, and there's complicated contracting issues around partial, what they call fractional quantities. There's round up and round downs at the end of the year. There's all kinds of stuff to sort of balance it out. But
Dan, we have another question over here, sir.
sure.
Yeah, one last simple question. Since you mentioned the Jones Act, what is the possibility at the government Guam perspective?
I'm sorry.
To
I didn't
get
catch the
away-
first
To
part,
get
I'm
away from the U.S. government.
Oh, the Jones Act.
Yes.
Yeah, the difficulty is that, people have been fighting the Jones Act. I was involved as a really, really young lawyer right out of law school. And one of the first things I did was I worked with a group of people trying to get the Jones Act repealed. And I found out after a few years of beating my head against a wall that that's not going to happen. And it still hasn't. It's a very protectionist piece of legislation, and it was intentionally so. And the people that argue that it hurts competitiveness, it raises prices, they've heard all those arguments. That was, those arguments were considered when the act was passed, and they made a legislative decision that it was worth taking on those downsides in order to protect the U.S. shipping industry. So I don't think that we're going to see the Jones Act go away. Now, there are some ways to get exemptions from the Jones Act, or waivers from the Jones Act. Some on a short-term basis. Some have to do with national security issues. I worked with a Korean builder who brought a derrick barge in to rebuild one of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. We got a Jones Act waiver because there was no other derrick barge that had that heavy lift capacity at that time, and we were rebuilding a federal highway, which is critical to the national infrastructure and moving troops and things. And we made up a bunch of arguments, and we convinced the Defense Department to write a letter of support, and we were able to get an exemption there. But they're very difficult to get. They're becoming very, very politicized, particularly in the LNG world. I think, you can talk to the folks in Hawaii. They've had this issue. The folks in Puerto Rico very, very carefully navigated this issue a few years ago and managed to get some waivers put in place. But it's an extremely complex process. It's best done outside the public light, and it requires you working with a lot of seafarers unions as well as shipbuilders to get the requisite level of support in order to get it through. There's also a legislative waiver process where you can actually get legislation introduced and approved that gives specific vessels certain exemptions for certain trades and things. And there's a handful or so of vessels that have gotten legislative waivers. So there's a couple ways to do it. Very, very difficult to do, very time consuming, and it's a strategic booby trap. I mean, it just, you're very, very, if you build your project around that, I just recommend that you don't, because there's just too much room for error, and until you're all the way through and you've got the waiver, you don't know that you have a project.
Even we have a lot of military bases here in Guam, still same situation.
Military? Yeah, well, if you can show this is fuel supply for a military use, you might be able to make an argument on a national security is one of the grounds for a waiver. So if that's where the LNG is predominantly going to go, you may have an argument there, but.
Okay. All right, well, let's give a round of applause to Daniel, please. Thank you.